Good evening, friends. Again, I am back among you all with my with your new channel, GS Guru. I myself, Dr.Syed Amir Hussain. In continuation of my last topic, today I will be discussing about prominent administrative and legislative reforms before 1857. 1857 के पूर्व प्रमुख जो प्रशासनिक और लेजिस्लेटिव चेंजेस हुआ उसके आज हम लोग इस वीडियो में विस्तार से चर्चा करेंगे। At the very outset, in the very beginning itself, one thing I want to make crystal clear to all of you is that these prominent administrative and legislative reforms before 1857 was only meant to help the Britishers, and in no way these administrative and legislative reforms were meant to help the Indians. These important acts before 1857, administrative and legislative acts before 1857, this was basically meant to check the autocratic power of British East India Company. Autocratic power of British East India Company. British actually, here time and again I will be telling about British East India Company. As we all know that there were other East India Company also, just as French East India Company, Dutch East India Company. So it is remarkable here, it is quite, it should be pointed here that we are talking about the English East India Company or the British East India Company. British East India Company. We are not discussing about French East India Company or the Dutch East India Company. Rather, we are exclusively focusing here on the British East India Company. The British East India Company became so powerful and so autocrat in their actions that the British Parliament, their style of functioning became autocratic, जिसको हम लोग हिंदी में कह सकते हैं कि इंग्लिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के द्वारा ऑटोक्रेटिक तानाशाह के तरह से गवर्न किया जा रहा था. So the British government or the British Parliament they became scared. They thought that the English East India Company, British East India Company was becoming day by day autocrat in their functioning, and they became the British Parliament or the British government in Britain became apprehensive. They thought that the British East India Company was challenging their authority. Was challenging their authority. And as such, the British government, or you can say that the British Parliament, they became scared. उन लोग डर गए थे कि इंग्लिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के द्वारा तानाशाह के रूप में शासन किया जा रहा था, और उन्हें ऐसा प्रतीत हो रहा था कि जैसे वो ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के द्वारा ब्रिटिश पार्लियामेंट और ब्रिटिश गवर्नमेंट को उन लोग चैलेंज कर रहे हैं अथवा उनके लिए चुनौती बन रहे हैं. So, in order to check the powers of the British East India Company, the British government or the British Parliament came out with various acts such as Regulating Act, Regulating Act of 1773. Another was Pitt's India Act. Pitt's India Act of 1784 and various charter acts. These were some of the prominent administrative and legislative reforms before the year 1857 in order to keep a check and balance on the power of the East India Company. The East India Company, they were working in the fashion of an autocratic ruler, or the British Parliament or the British government, they became apprehensive and they thought that the British East India Company was challenging their authority. So, in order to curb their powers or in order to check their powers so that they could not behave in an autocratic way, the British government or the British Parliament came out with various acts such as the Regulating Act of 1773, Pitt's India Act of 1784 and various charter acts. And various charter act of 1813, 1833, 1853, so once again I repeat it here that some of the acts were enacted by the British Parliament or the British government in order to check the uncontrolled power of the British East India Company. Prominent among them were Regulating Act of 1773, Pitt's India Act of 1784 and various different charter acts of 1813, 1833 and 1853. First of all, I will be discussing here about the Regulating Act of 1773. सर्वप्रथम यहाँ पर मेरे द्वारा रेगुलेटिंग कानून की चर्चा की जाएगी, जिसको 1773 में लाया गया था और उसका मुख्य उद्देश्य था कि ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी को अनुशासित करे और उसका जो अनकंट्रोल्ड पावर है उसको चेक किया जा सके. रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट ऑफ 1773. The most prominent feature of Regulating Act of 1773 was that the British East India Company the governance of the British East India Company was put under the British parliamentary control. ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी का गवर्नेंस को ब्रिटिश पार्लियामेंट्री कंट्रोल के अधीन लाया गया, जो कि रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट ऑफ विच वाज वन ऑफ द मोस्ट प्रोमिनेंट कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ द रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट ऑफ 1773. Another most important characteristics of this Regulating Act of 1773 is that the Governor of Bengal was nominated as the Governor General. The Governor of Bengal was nominated as the Governor General by this very particular Regulating Act of 1773. So, Governor of Bengal was nominated as the Governor General for the presidency of another most important characteristics of Regulating Act of 1773 is that the Governor of Bengal was nominated as the Governor General. Governor General for the presidency of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. At that time, it was called Madras. Nowadays, it is known as Chennai. But during those time, it was known as Madras, and Mumbai was also known as Bombay. So, the Governor General of the Governor of Bengal was nominated as the Governor General for the presidency of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. So it was one of the most notable characteristics of the Regulating Act of 1773. In other words, it can be safely said that the governor of the presidency of Bombay, Madras became subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal. इन दूसरे शब्दों में इसको सरल तरीके से ऐसे भी समझ सकते हैं जैसे कि गवर्नर थे मद्रास और बॉम्बे और मद्रास प्रेसिडेंसी के, उन लोग को बंगाल के गवर्नर जनरल के अधीन लाया गया। ये 1773 के रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट के द्वारा। So it is another most important characteristics or the features of the Regulating Act of 1773 that the Governor of Bengal was nominated as the Governor General for the presidency of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. Or in other words, we can say that the Governor of Bombay, Madras became subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal by this very particular act, which we call it as the Regulating Act of 1773. Here I am discussing about the prominent features or the characteristics of the Regulating Act of 1773. Warren Hastings was the first such Governor General under the Regulating Act of 1773. All of you must note it that Warren Hastings was the first Governor General nominated under the Regulating Act of 1773. This is very important. Everyone must note it that the Warren Hastings was the first person to be nominated as a Governor General through the Regulating Act of 1773. Here, although there were various features under the Regulating Act of 1773, but we are focusing here about the most important or the prominent characteristics of the Regulating Act. रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट के तहत अधीन बहुत सारी विशेषताएं थी, मगर उसमें से जो प्रमुख विशेषताएं थी इस लेक्चर में मेरे द्वारा उन प्रमुख विशेषताओं की चर्चा की जा रही है. उसी रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट एंड द अदर मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट फीचर्स और यू कैन कॉल इट कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स of Regulating Act of 1773 was that it established by the Regulating Act of 1773, one of the most important characteristics of the feature of this act was that the Supreme Court of India was established in the year 1784. 1784 में रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट के द्वारा सुप्रीम कोर्ट ऑफ इंडिया की स्थापना की गई एंड इट वाज एस्टैब्लिश्ड इन कैलकाटा. For the first time, Supreme Court of India was established by Regulating Act of 1773 in the year 1784 in Calcutta. सर्वप्रथम भारत में सर्वोच्च न्यायालय अर्थात उच्चतम न्यायालय की स्थापना रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट के द्वारा की गई सन 1784 में एंड दैट सुप्रीम कोर्ट ऑफ इंडिया वाज सेट अप इन कैलकाटा. It is another most important features or the characteristics of the Regulating Act of 1773 that the Supreme Court of India was first of all set up in India in the year 1784 and it was set up in Calcutta. There was a Chief Justice there was one Chief Justice there was one Chief Justice and three judges. There was one Chief Justice and three judges in that Supreme Court, which was set up by the Act of Regulating Act of 1773. 1773 के द्वारा जो उच्चतम न्यायालय की स्थापना की गई 1784 में कलकत्ता में, उस समय वो उच्चतम न्यायालय अर्थात सर्वोच्च न्यायालय में एक मुख्य न्यायाधीश हुआ करते थे और तीन अधर न्यायाधीश हुआ करते थे. वन चीफ जस्टिस, इट वाज हेडेड बाय वन चीफ जस्टिस and there were three other judges. This is extremely important and all the students must surely note it, and it might come in questions also, that the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was Sir Eliza MP. भारत के जो रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट के द्वारा सर्वोच्च न्यायालय की स्थापना की गई थी, तो उसके जो प्रथम मुख्य न्यायाधीश थे उनका नाम था सर एलिजा एमपी. एलिजा एमपी was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of India, set up by the Regulating Act of 1773. Eliza MP was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Eliza MP, once again I am repeating here, is that Sir Eliza MP was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of India, set up by the Regulating Act of 1773. Now I will be discussing about the name of the three judges of the Supreme Court. As I have told you earlier that the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was Sir Elijah MP, and the other three judges were, all students must surely note this, the name of the other three judges were Chambers. One was Mr. Chambers, other name was Mr. Leominster, and the third one was Heidi. These were the three judges of the Supreme Court whose name were Chambers, Leominster, and Heidi. These were the names of the three judges of Supreme Court. These were the three judges of Supreme Court whose name was, one was Mr. Chambers, other was Leominster, and the third was Heidi. This is, all students must surely note this. This is very typical and particular. These names you will get somewhere very seldom in the books, but these were the names of the three judges of the Supreme Court, headed by one Chief Justice whose name was Sir Elijah MP. Now, after discussing the Regulating Act of 1773, I will come to the Pitt's India Act. I will be discussing here about the Pitt's After discussing in detail about the various major characteristics of the Regulating Act, now I will be discussing here about the Pitt's India Act, जिसको हम लोग हिंदी में पिट्स का इंडिया एक्ट भी कहते हैं. It was enacted in the year 1784, and the basic purpose of this act was to make provisions for the improvement of the Regulating Act. Regulating Act में सुधार करने हेतु दूसरा कानून ब्रिटिश सरकार के द्वारा लाया गया, जिसको हम लोग पिट्स इंडिया एक्ट के नाम से जानते हैं. एंड द मेन फोकस वाज टू मेक इम्प्रूवमेंट इन द प्रोविजंस ऑफ द रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट ऑफ 1773. And this Pitt's India Act, the name of this act was Pitt's India Act. It was named after the name of the British Prime Minister ब्रिटिश प्राइम मिनिस्टर विलियम पिट्स के नाम पर ये पिट्स इंडिया एक्ट का नाम पड़ा. ब्रिटिश प्राइम मिनिस्टर The name of this Pitt's India Act was coined after the name of the British Prime Minister Mr. William Pitt. विलियम पिट के नाम के आधार पर इस कानून का नाम पिट्स इंडिया एक्ट कानून पड़ा। Here again I will be discussing about the major characteristics of Pitt's India Act. The main motive behind bringing this act by the British Parliament or the government was to make improvement in the provisions of the Regulating Act of 1773, or in other words we can say that in order to for better governance of the East India Company, or to make the British East India Company more disciplined, this act was brought for making it more disciplined, or we can say that for better governance of the East India Company. This Pitt India Act was enacted in the year 1784. This Pitt's India Act completely differentiated the political and commercial functions of the East India Company. वो पॉलिटिकल और कमर्शियल फंक्शंस में डिफरेंशिएट किया गया इस पिट्स इंडिया एक्ट के द्वारा ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी। फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम another most notable characteristics of the Pitt's India Act is that the territories acquired by the British East India Company, or we can say that the English East India Company, the territories acquired by the British East India Company was known as the British possession. जो क्षेत्र ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के द्वारा भारत में एक्वायर किया गया था, सो उनको सामूहिक रूप से द टेरिटरीज एक्वायर्ड बाय द ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी इन इंडिया वाज कलेक्टिवली नोन एज द ब्रिटिश पोजेशंस इन इंडिया। इस एक्ट के द्वारा जो भी क्षेत्र ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी इंग्लिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के द्वारा एक्वायर किया गया था, उनको सामूहिक रूप से हम लोग ब्रिटिश पोजीशन इन इंडिया के नाम से भी जानते हैं। Another most important characteristics, another most important characteristics of the Pitt's India Act was that the dual system of government was started, जिसको हम लोग हिंदी में द्वैध शासन के रूप में भी जानते हैं। This was the most notable or important characteristics of the Pitt's India Act, that this dual system of government was introduced for the first time in India, जिसको हम लोग हिंदी में द्वैध शासन के रूप में भी जानते हैं। तो हम लोग इसको पिट्स इंडिया एक्ट की एक महत्वपूर्ण विशेषता के रूप में भी हम लोग जानते हैं। द ड्यूअल सिस्टम ऑफ गवर्नमेंट वाज एस्टैब्लिश्ड इन इंडिया बाय दिस वेरी पिट्स इंडिया एक्ट। ड्यूअल सिस्टम ऑफ गवर्नमेंट, जिसको हम लोग द्वैध शासन के नाम से भी हिंदी में जानते हैं। Another, last but not the least important characteristics of the Pitt's East India Act was that the trade and commerce related issues were exclusively dealt by the court of directors. Another most important provisions of this Pitt's India Act was that the trade and commerce issues, trade and commerce, this trade and commerce related issues were exclusively dealt by the court of directors of the British East India Company। जो हम लोग कह सकते हैं कि व्यापार और वाणिज्य से रिलेटेड जो भी महत्वपूर्ण तथ्य था उसको डील करने के लिए कोर्ट ऑफ डायरेक्टर्स के द्वारा डील किया जाता था। ऑल द मेजर इंपॉर्टेंट ट्रेड एंड कॉमर्स रिलेटेड इश्यूज वेर एक्सक्लूसिवली dealt by the court of directors according to this Pitt's India Act. After discussing the Regulating Act, Pitt's India Act, now I come to the different Charter Acts. उन सब रेगुलेटिंग एक्ट्स, पिट इंडिया एक्ट्स पे चर्चा करने के बाद हम लोग चार्टर एक्ट पे आते हैं. देयर वर वेरियस डिफरेंट चार्टर एक्ट्स. वन वाज ऑफ चार्टर एक्ट ऑफ 1813, 1833 and 1853. One of the most prominent characteristics of this Charter Act of 1813 is that the trade monopoly of the English East India Company, or what we can call it as British East India Company, came to an end with this very particular Charter Act of 1813. It was the most prominent or the important characteristics of Charter Act of 1813 that the trade monopoly of English East India Company came to an end. जो व्यापार का एक अधिकार ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी को प्राप्त था, वो इस चार्टर एक्ट 1813 के चार्टर एक्ट के द्वारा इसको खत्म कर दिया गया. सो वी कैन से दैट दिस वाज वन ऑफ द मोस्ट important characteristics of Charter Act of 1813, that the trade monopoly of the East India Company was ended by this very particular Charter Act of 1813. Another most notable characteristics or the prominent characteristics of the Charter Act of 1813 was that the Christian missionaries were allowed to carry out their teachings. Christian missionaries were allowed to spread their religion in India by this very particular Charter Act of 1813. 1813 के चार्टर एक्ट के द्वारा 1813 के चार्टर एक्ट के द्वारा क्रिश्चियन मिशनरी को भारत में अपने धर्म के प्रचार की अनुमति प्रदान कर दी गई थी. The Christian missionaries were allowed to spread their religion in India by this very particular Charter Act of 1813. And last but not the least, another important characteristics of the Charter Act of 1813 was that the local authorities or the local bodies were empowered to levy taxes. स्थानीय क्षेत्र को कर टैक्स ये लेने की भी अनुमति प्रदान की गई थी. दिस वॉज वन ऑफ द अदर इंपॉर्टेंट प्रोविजंस इन द चार्टर एक्ट ऑफ 1813. Now, after discussing the Charter Act of 1813, now I will be discussing about the Charter Act of 1833. इस जो 1833 का चार्टर एक्ट था, इसकी क्या क्या मुख्य और प्रमुख विशेषता थी, उसको हम लोग अभी विस्तार रूप से डिटेल रूप में आई विल बी डिस्कसिंग अबाउट सम ऑफ द इंपॉर्टेंट कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स और उसकी अबाउट दिस चार्टर एक्ट ऑफ 1833. व्हाट वाज द इंपॉर्टेंट कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स enshrined in this very particular चार्टर एक्ट ऑफ 1833. 1833 के चार्टर एक्ट की प्रमुख विशेषताओं को हम लोग यहां पर डिस्कस करेंगे. The most notable or the most notable and the most important characteristics of this Charter Act of 1833 was that it made the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India. Governor General of Bengal now became the Governor General of India by this very particular Charter Act of 1833. जो बंगाल के गवर्नर जनरल थे, अब उनको पूरे भारत के गवर्नर जनरल के रूप में जाना जाने लगा, जो 1833 के चार्टर एक्ट की प्रमुख विशेषता थी. द गवर्नर जनरल ऑफ बंगाल was now called as the Governor General of India. Lord William Bentinck was the first Governor General of India. Lord William Bentinck, as you can clearly see in this board, that Lord William Bentinck was the first Governor General of India, and I would request here all students to kindly remember this name, that Lord William Bentinck became the first Governor General of India. In short form, I am writing here GG. GG stands for Governor General, and Lord William Bentinck became the first Governor General of India. Another most glaring features of this Charter Act of 1833 is that this particular Charter Act of 1833 ended the monopoly of the British East India Company to trade in tea and to trade with China. Trade in tea and trade with China was abolished by this very particular Charter Act of 1833, जो ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी की मोनोपोली थी चाय का व्यापार और चीन के साथ जो व्यापार किया जाता था उसको ये चार्टर एक्ट ऑफ 1833 के द्वारा इट वाज एबॉलिश्ड बाय ट्रेड इन टी as well as the trade with China was abolished by their Charter Act of 1833. It was the most prominent feature and characteristics of the Charter Act of 1833. Another most important characteristics of the provision of Charter Act of 1833 was that for the first time law commission was set up. Law Commission was set up for the first time in India by this very particular Charter Act of 1833. So we can say that the another most glaring characteristics or the features of the Charter Act of 1833 was that the Law Commission was set up in India by this very particular act, जिसको हम लोग हिंदी में कहते हैं कि प्रथम विधि आयोग का गठन किया गया 1833 में 1833 के चार्टर एक्ट के द्वारा एंड द फर्स्ट लॉ कमिश्नर एंड द फर्स्ट in order to codify the Indian laws, the Law Commission of India was set up by this Charter Act of 1833, and the first chairman of this first Law Commission of India was Lord Macaulay. In the year 1835, Lord Macaulay was appointed as the first chairman of this लॉ कमीशन 1835 में सर्वप्रथम लॉर्ड मैकुले की नियुक्ति प्रथम अध्यक्ष विधि आयोग के प्रथम अध्यक्ष के रूप में की गई. सो इट वाज आल्सो वन ऑफ द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स ऑफ दिस चार्टर एक्ट ऑफ 1833. Slavery is another utmost important characteristics of this Charter Act of 1833 was that the slavery system in India was declared illegal by this very particular act, जिसको हम लोग हिंदी में कह सकते हैं कि दास प्रथा जो भारत में उस टाइम में प्रचलित थी उसको असंवैधानिक करार दिया गया और 1843 में and in the year 1843 ultimately the slavery system in India was abolished by the Charter Act of 1833. 1833 के चार्टर एक्ट के द्वारा सर्वप्रथम भारत में प्रचलित दास प्रथा को असंवैधानिक करार दिया गया. इट वॉज डिक्लेयर्ड इलीगल थ्रू दिस चार्टर एक्ट एंड फाइनली इट वॉज एबॉलिश्ड इन द ईयर 1843. 1843 में पूरी तरह से दास प्रथा को एबॉलिश किया गया, अर्थात इसको खत्म किया गया, जो कि चार्टर एक्ट ऑफ 1833 का एक इंपॉर्टेंट कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स और प्रावधान है. And finally, I will be discussing about the last most important charter act of Charter Act of 1853 was one of the last Charter Act in its series. जैसे कि चार्टर एक्ट के सीरीज का ये आखिरी 1853 का चार्टर एक्ट था और इसकी अनेक प्रमुख विशेषताएं थी, जिसमें सबसे प्रोमिनेंट विशेषता यह थी कि इस चार्टर एक्ट के द्वारा ब्रिटिश पार्लियामेंट और संविधान के द्वारा यह घोषित कर दिया गया था कि अब ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी को व्यापार करने की अनुमति खत्म कर दी जाएगी. One of the most important characteristics of the Charter Act of 1853 was that it was declared by the British Parliament that British Parliament was empowered to put British East India Company governance of India to an end at any suitable time. And another most important provisions of this Charter Act of 1853 was that the employees of East India Company employees of East India Company, or we can say that the staff of the East India Company staff of the British East India Company was now recruited through an open competitive examination. इस 1853 की सबसे महत्वपूर्ण विशेषता यह थी कि ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी, ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के द्वारा जो भी स्टाफ की नियुक्ति की जाती थी, अब उसकी नियुक्ति अब प्रतियोगिता परीक्षा के आधार पे की जाने लगी. एंड फॉर द फर्स्ट टाइम द स्टाफ ऑफ द ईस्ट द एम्प्लॉयज ऑफ द ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी वाज रिक्रूटेड थ्रू एन ओपन कॉम्पिटिटिव एग्जामिनेशन. कंपटीशन के द्वारा, प्रतियोगिता परीक्षा के द्वारा अब ब्रिटिश ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी के कर्मियों की नियुक्ति की जाती थी, जो इस 1853 के चार्टर एक्ट की एक प्रमुख विशेषता थी. सो विद दिस टुडे आई विल बी एंडिंग माय दिस वीडियो. अगेन आई विल बी बैक अमंग यू ऑल very soon. So till then, goodbye. Take care of your health as well as your studies.